I'm Mary Husong-Callan, president of the local League of Women Voters here in Rochester. The League, as many of you know, is...
Can't hear you very well.
How about now?
Yeah.
Okay. The League, as you know, is a nonpartisan political organization which encourages the informed and active participation of citizens in their government. We influence public policy through education and advocacy, and we focus significant effort on registering new voters and encouraging them to get out and vote. If you're not registered to vote, we'd be happy to talk to you at one of the tables here. By the way, the League of Women Voters is not limited to women. Men are most welcome to join us in making democracy work. On behalf of all of the members of the Rochester League, I'd like to welcome you to this forum, exploring experiences in our country's history as an argument for voting. Sisters Ann Urquhart, Sister Josepha, and Sister Barbara Lum are members of the Sisters of St. Joseph here in Rochester. You may also know that when they served at the SSJ mission in Selma, Alabama, they helped save the life of U.S. Representative John Lewis, among many others, who were brutally beaten on Bloody Sunday at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma in 1965. Reverend Marvin McMickle is president and a professor at Colgate Rochester Crozer Divinity School, also in Rochester. He's also director of the program of Black Church Studies. He spoke at our forum on the Shelby County Supreme Court decision, which gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and he'll be familiar to many who read the editorial pages of the Democrat Chronicle. We're proud to present this important discussion, and we're especially pleased to be able to offer a question and answer segment following the presentations. We request, of course, that all of our guests respect our panel, our hosts here at Asbury First United Methodist Church, and the League's own commitment to civil and respectful discourse. Please join me in welcoming Sister Ann Urquhart, Sister Josepha, Sister Barbara Lum, and Reverend McMickle.
Good evening, everyone. It's a privilege to be here this evening, and thank you for inviting us. And it's a privilege to be here with Dr. McMickle and to be able to hear his presentation on this most important topic, history as an argument for voting. The topic is inexhaustible. The Sisters of St. Joseph have a long history in the city of Selma, and Mary mentioned that's where we served. We started our mission there in 1940 in response to a call to work in the southern states, particularly among the African American community. We soon opened a school for black children. We renovated and opened a nursing home. We visited people in their homes to determine the needs of the community. And in the early 40s, the sisters were invited to staff Good Samaritan Hospital, founded by the Fathers of St. Edmund, to serve the black community of Selma. Eventually, we opened a school of practical nursing, the first of its kind, for African Americans in the state of Alabama. The city of Selma, population 21,000, sits on the banks of the Alabama River. And because of its location, it became a valuable port before and during the Civil War. Selma was a manufacturing hub for armaments and weapons for the Confederate Army, and in 1864, General Edmund Pettus led the troops in the Battle of Selma. They lost the battle, but every year they reenact the Battle of Selma, and I don't think they've won it yet. They're trying. photo of that.
It's at the end, I didn't put it at the beginning.
We're doing the video clip.
Can we do the video clip, or I can get to it?
So, there it is, the famous the infamous Edmund Pettus Bridge, named in honor of General Pettus, Edmund Pettus, is itself an architectural feat. And our sister city's bridge here in Rochester, I think, is a similar structure. The Bridge to Freedom, as it is sometimes called, is the place where people suffered and sacrificed, and where history was made in 1965. The Sisters of St. Joseph are deeply entwined with the history of the voting rights movement and the events of March 7, 1965, known as Bloody Sunday. And Sister Josepha and Sister Barbara Lum, who both were working in Selma in 1965, will share their stories.
Thank you very much. Is this on? Thank you. Doesn't sound like it's on.
Harry, you know what that is?
Let's see what kind of magic we can do.
All right, because I need volume. All right, something I was going to say about that bridge or that day that slipped my mind while we were doing this. But so I'll begin where I was going to begin, which is a few weeks before Bloody Sunday, a young man from Marion, Alabama, who was well known to the civil rights community in Selma, was killed by state troopers in a night march for civil rights. And before he died, however, he was brought to Good Samaritan Hospital, where we did care for him. And every day that I went in to see Jimmy Lee Jackson, he would take my hand and say, "Sister, don't you think this is a high price to pay for freedom?" So I think of him every time I vote. Moving forward to Bloody Sunday, he was the catalyst. His death was the catalyst for the decision to march on Bloody Sunday. And that march was led by Hosea Williams and by now Congressman John Lewis, both young men in their early 20s. And before they marched, some other people came to the hospital to ask if I would fix a first aid kit for them. And so unsuspecting was I, which I shouldn't have been, but that I just fixed a little simple first aid kit and kind of said, go, hope it all goes well. And a couple hours later, people began coming back to our emergency room, and in all, we had about 100 people that we treated in our emergency room. And I'm not sure if there were others that got triaged past emergency and were in our dining room, in the halls, because I was in the emergency room the whole time. So John Lewis was admitted to the hospital unconscious and has ever since said, "The Sisters of St. Joseph of Rochester saved my life." And I think that goes way back to the 1940 sisters ever saying yes to, "We will come and open that mission." So we treated people, and the doctor that I was working with, there were 3 stretchers, 3 bays with stretchers in the emergency room. And the doctor I was working with was a white doctor, and he kept saying, I know you wouldn't have done this, to whoever was on the table at the time. I know you would never have done this. It was outside agitators that kind of put you up to this. And as if life was so wonderful for people of color in the South that who would ever have thought of protesting. Voting rights were very hard to come by. There was all kinds of resistance to allowing people to vote. And I won't go into all of that, but there were just as many barriers as you could think of, including essays on all kinds of obscure topics. After Bloody Sunday came the voting rights. Voting rights was passed, Lyndon B. Johnson using the words of the Civil Rights Anthem, "We shall overcome," when he signed the Voting Rights Act. And people that I knew in Selma dressed up for the occasion. They dressed to go to the voting booth and or the polling places. There were tables. But it was just very impressive and very moving. And I remember one young man who worked at our hospital at Good Samaritan brought his son with him to see him vote, and then came back to Good Samaritan to tell me, I just wanted you to know that I voted, and this is my son, and I wanted him to see this. There was one other thing that I really wanted to say, and I can't think of it, so it's enough.
We're gonna do the video now.
When I would go in to visit him, each day he would take my hand and say, "Sister, don't you think this is a high price to pay for freedom?"
Sister Barbara Long says every time she tells the story of her friend Jimmy Lee Jackson, it takes her back to February 18th, 1965. Jackson was beaten and shot by state troopers while participating in a peaceful voting march. He was then transported to the Good Samaritan Hospital in Selma, Alabama, the same hospital that was run and operated by the Sisters of St. Joseph of Rochester, New York. This was the only facility in 9 counties that would serve Black people. Jackson died 8 days later, and this was the start of the Selma to Montgomery March.
When I was in high school and in grade school, the Sisters of St. Joseph had talked about the Selma missions, but I had no idea what it was going to be like.
In Selma, the White Citizens Council, also known as a white segregationist group, controlled the city, like the mayor and judges. This group used scare tactics to keep Blacks from voting. Sister Barbara would write about the doubt she would hear from Blacks in Selma.
It will never come to Selma. Selma is way too tightly controlled for it to ever come to Selma.
That is until days later when she was approached by a teacher and a reverend asking for a favor.
There's a group going to march this afternoon, and would you fix a first aid kit? Oh, sure. I never imagined, nor did they, what was going to happen to them.
At the foot of Edmund Pettus Bridge, 600 peaceful marchers were met by state and local police. They were chased down by horses, beaten with billy clubs, and sprayed with tear gas. Soon, Good Samaritan Hospital was flooded with victims.
People were saturated with tear gas, and we had a small 3-bed emergency room, and so all of us were saturated with tear gas. And people just leaped in and did what we knew how to do.
Bloody Sunday, that horrific day. Sister Barbara saw over 100 patients, one of which would become a U.S. representative for Georgia's 5th Congressional District.
John Lewis, who was one of the leaders of the march, was severely beaten and had a concussion.
Last October, Congressman Lewis paid the Sisters of St. Joseph a visit and expressed his gratitude for their compassion 50 years ago.
I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. You blessed us. You saved us.
I'm marching today from Selma to Montgomery.
The march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama was inspiration for future marches in the civil rights movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
And I think this is a demonstration of progress that is definitely being made.
I think that high price for freedom isn't finished yet.
The courage of ordinary people to fight for equality continues years later. In Rochester, Waukesha Bailey.
Almost got me. Thank you. I have 85 pages here. I intend to read every one. I want to thank you, first of all, for allowing me to come in to the church tonight. Because for years, another sister and I, when we were very young, a couple of years ago, had back trouble, and we were assigned a doctor down here in the Alexander Street area. And every time we came to this church, we took the bus. Every time we came past this church, this is what I would hear. Every time we came past this church, see that church? My father built that church. And on we go, we come home, my father built that church. And I tell you, I think I went to 600 doctor's appointments with it because I was so bored by it and so getting very good. Not I, but I felt something was going on. I thought to myself, I am not going to ask her how her father built that church. I still do not know. I actually looked for her yesterday in the dining room and I couldn't find her. I was really angry. And I couldn't find out how her father built that church. My name is Sister Josepha. I'm a Toomey girl from Auburn, New York, TWOMEY. I was assigned to Alabama 1 year after I spent a year living with Sister Frances Marie, who was this big and who started the mission in Selma, Alabama. And if that wasn't one of the greatest privileges of my life, she was a hellion. She loved Selma, and she told all her stories about Selma. She had glass slides. She had a Kodak slide machine. I never saw glass slides until that. She would set everything up on the superior's desk. We would hear this when the superior wasn't home, and we were using it for a half-hour meditation. Anyway, she would go through things like, Sister Ann just talked about starting this. She said, this is the way she would start it. Mother Rose Miriam called and said, Sister, I want you to start a clinic. So we did. The next year, Mother called us and said, Sister, we want you to start a school, 1 grade at a time, till you got to 8 grades. And we did. Mother Rose Miriam called the next year and told us to start a nursing home. And we did. It went on ever. And we were hysterical. I said to her at one point, Sister Frances Marie, you make it sound as if Mother said, would you like to cross the street, sister? And she said, we did. We did. Anyway, I was assigned to teach the 5th and 6th grade at St. Elizabeth's School in Selma. And as you saw with Sister Barbara, it's very difficult sometimes to 50 years later, talk about what happened on Bloody Sunday. It was quite an experience. The school teacher's bar called, she was on duty that day, she called and said, we need all this hospital sisters over. And then she called back and said, we need the school teachers too. So we were all someplace in the hospital. I had the job of going from Central Supply was my job. I didn't know where Central Supply was. I didn't know what Central Supply was. But I found it quickly. People in the dining room, as she said, reeking with gas orders. It was a just so very sad, so very sad. I'm going to tell you, though, about one of the young men who visited my classroom. One of the 5th grade girls came up very early on in the school year, and she stood in front of my desk and said, "Sister, could we bring Jonathan and do something with him for show and tell?" And a boy's voice from Ray Heiner, who was in the 6th grade, said very quietly to her, "Linda, we don't have show and tell in our classroom." She turned around, it was her older brother. She turned around and she said, "Shut up, girl." She said very quietly. She wanted us, and I said, "We better talk about it and find out who Jonathan is." Jonathan was a young man from the Boston area. He was from New Hampshire. He was an Episcopalian school graduate, and he was in Bible school. He was in school to become an Episcopalian minister. He saw things, he heard things, he read things about Selma and what was happening. He went back to New Hampshire and talked to his family and packed up everything and moved to Selma. When he got off the plane, strange thing, Mr. and Mrs. West were there from Selma. Montgomery is 50 miles from Selma. You land in Montgomery and will ride in through Selma on a car. And it's very scary knowing that Lowndes County is there where so much happened. Very scary it was. They have widened the road significantly in the last many years. We went back for 50 years. But Jonathan came. Jonathan got into all kinds of things, voter registration, teaching people how to register, what they need to know, getting them to a registered office. Did all kinds of things. Anything that needed to be done, Jonathan did and was willing to do it. Very lovely man. He explained that when he came in for show and tell, and we did let him show and tell. Very nice. He appeared in his black outfit with his white collar. We also had a lady in Selma, staying in Selma, Viola Liuzzo from Detroit. She was married, had 5 growing children, and as happened with Jonathan, she got the idea that too she could be doing something in Selma, down in the South, that would be of help to get people to vote, and get people to do what normal Americans hopefully do. And so she had her discussion with her family, and also just got in her car and drove to Selma. And one of the things that you find out about Mrs. Liuzzo was her car was what she used most of the time. She did everything. She drove people wherever they needed to go for whatever they had to do. And of course the voter registration was so important to the hospital. The reason I tell you about those 2 people is because both of them were shot and killed. Jonathan was probably, he wasn't 30 yet, he was probably, I think, 26. He was killed by a man. He went to a store out in Lowndes County, and he was just looking for something to eat. He hadn't eaten as he worked through the day. He was looking for crackers, something to eat, something to drink. He needed water. He shot him with a 12-gauge shotgun, and he was dead. Mrs. Liuzzo, using her car for as long as she was there, she got quite sick one day because she was just so overtired, so she stayed away from work. She was back and forth from Montgomery to Selma, often, always on the road in her car. And when she was not feeling well, she went home and took a nap. But she left her car, which I think just says what kind of a woman. She wouldn't go home unless she left the car because somebody might have to go to the clinic or to the hospital or a doctor or whatever. There might be something that they need from a grocery store, from whatever store. So she left her car. And a couple of days later, she realized that she was feeling a little bit better. She thought she could go back to work. And when she got back to work, someone told her that it was a good thing she was back because her car was being driven by a young man who did not have a license. And he was waiting to get home up to Selma. And so she said she would take him. And one of the things I read was she spoke gently to the mountain boy and did not scold him, just explained that he shouldn't be driving a car because he wasn't old enough. Which, the gently thing really got me because I'd probably be furious with the young man, but she was gentle to him. Wonderful, wonderful. The same, I put them together because there were two other people besides Jimmy Lee. There was also Reverend Reed. Reverend Reed got off the plane from Boston. He was a Unitarian minister. He got off the plane in Montgomery with two friends, and he was dead the very next day. They went to a restaurant. I told you. They went to a restaurant in, I think it was in Montgomery. They were given directions to the restaurant, but unfortunately, they're little places. They're small little places down there. And they wanted Southern food. They didn't want American food. They wanted Southern food. So they were given directions, but on the way to where they were going, they passed a restaurant that was used by many people from the KKK. And that was the mistake. When they came out of the restaurant, Reverend Reed wanted to call his wife and just to tell her they were there and how things were going. So the other two men walked away, the other two ministers walked away, and a woman turned to see him being clubbed in the side of the head and dying the next day. He had to be taken to Birmingham because we didn't have a neurosurgeon who could handle the particular problem that he had. He died the very next day, very next afternoon. And I put the other two together. I put Jonathan and Mrs. Uzo together because when I was putting this talk together, I found, and of course in this 85 pages, I can't find the one I want. This is what I found about the trial for the man who killed Jonathan Daniels. Out of the book, this is what I found about his trial. Jonathan had died August 20th. This is the courtroom. There was a jury of 12 white men. One of the jury members was the Grand Dragon of the Alabama KKK. In the audience was the infinite wizard of the KKK. It took 96 minutes to come up with a verdict of acquittal on all charges. The judge had refused to charge murder. He charged manslaughter. Those of us who worked in prison know the difference. Much, much difference between one and the other. What the worst thing I found was 3 of the men in the jury were 3 men who had already been tried for Mrs. Liuzzo's murder. There were 3 KKK men. They were waiting for a retrial on her case, and they were sitting on Jonathan's case. That information is just to give you what the court system. And you know, one of the things, I'll say it quietly, Mr. the new Attorney General of the United States was a Selma boy originally. And also, he was their Attorney General in Alabama. And now we have him for ours. He wasn't on this, he was not the judge here, but I just passed it on. And that's why I put them together, because I found that last item about the jury, and it just drives me crazy. I can't believe it. Thank you.
While we're waiting for the sister to find a better spot, I know there's Sisters of St. Joseph in the crowd. May I ask you please to stand up? The rest of the sisters for the order. Maybe afterwards we can kind of gather and get a group picture, please. Thank you. Okay.
All right, tough act to follow.
The sisters taught me, and there was one sister who I'm still in contact with, who was our yearbook editor, and I see her several times a year. It's Sister Margaret Brennan, or Peggy Brennan, and she always said, you can't be a nun, a small child, or a dog, or a creature. You know, they are just magnets for attention, and being drawn to them in terms of being in public. But these sisters, they were spectacular, you see, and they continue to be spectacular, and I need them like this. So.
Well, thank you all, both for what you did in 1965 and what you continue to do. So grateful to all of you for your work. So what I've been asked to do is to give a little historical context to African American voting rights using Bloody Sunday and the march from Selma to Montgomery as a point of reference, but only as a point of reference. So what events occurred prior to and after the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act that was made possible, the act, largely by the people and events involved in the Selma to Montgomery, Alabama march between March the 7th, the first attempt to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which was, as you just heard, the date for Bloody Sunday. There were then other days when there were attempts to cross the bridge and they were canceled for one reason or another. And then finally the march began, and it was a 5-day march, 50 miles, but it took them 5 days, and they arrived in Montgomery on March the 25th. And that's the day that Dr. King gave one of his most notable speeches. See if this works. If not, I may need somebody to do it for me. Okay. Let's just see if it works. It doesn't. Okay. So here's the first point I want to make. The struggle for voting rights for African Americans is largely connected to the 15th Amendment. This is the actual language of the 15th Amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Race and color meaning that even if you weren't a slave, even if you were not in bondage, even if you were a free person, you were historically denied the right to vote because of race and color. The third category, or previous condition of servitude. And so those three categories are all lumped together. And in the final clause, the Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation adopted on February the 3rd of 1870. Next slide, please. Non-cooperative, there we go. There were, in fact, several other amendments to the U.S. Constitution, all of which worked to expand voting rights. So the 19th Amendment, adopted in 1920, which gave the right to vote to women. The right to vote shall not be abridged on account of gender or sex. Now bear in mind that for 50 years, theoretically, African American men had the right to vote while their white female owners, theoretically, did not. You can imagine the conversations around Southern dinner tables when former slaves were going to cast their votes and their former mistresses were by law prohibited from doing so. So of course the 19th Amendment took care of that, but it was 50 years later. The 24th Amendment outlawed the use of the poll tax. Poll taxes were not just used for African Americans. Many people living in poverty, many white people also suffered under the poll tax, which simply meant you had to post an amount of money with the court in order literally to buy access to the voting booth. You were taxed at the poll. $5, $10. Sometimes it was a $50 poll tax paid to the county, refundable when you left. Who had $50 to post for the right to vote in both primary and general elections? And then the third of these is the 26th Amendment in 1971, which lowered the voting age to 18. Well, of course, this was the Vietnam War era, and many people were saying, if I'm old enough to die for the country, I ought to be old enough to vote in the country. And so in 1971, the voting age was lowered to 18. So there are, in fact, 4 amendments to the U.S. Constitution that deal with the vote. The 15th, the 19th, the 24th, and the 26th Amendments. Now, thank you. The next slide talks about voting rights during the so-called Reconstruction period. Reconstruction defines the years of 1870 to 1876. From the time the voting rights of African Americans was established until the time it began to be chipped away. So the Reconstruction was a period of time when well over 2,000 African Americans were elected to local, county, state, and federal offices, sometimes by a popular election, sometimes by the legislature of the various states, but because they could vote, they were often voting for themselves. So very early on, the idea of block voting began, African Americans voting other African Americans into office. I make note of the fact that of that 2,000, over 200 of those were members of the clergy, who were also serving in a variety of political offices. One of whom, perhaps the most notable, was this person. Has anybody ever heard of that name? Hiram Revels. Hiram Revels. He was an African Methodist Episcopal clergyman. Before he was in politics, he was an organizer of all black military units for the United States colored troops in the Civil War. If you saw the movie Glory, you saw this amassing of all black regiments. Well, he was an actual recruiter for regiments like that, though not in Massachusetts. He was in Missouri and Maryland. He then gravitated down to Mississippi. He was elected to the Mississippi State Senate. And in 1870, he was elected by the state legislature to fill the seat in the Senate from Mississippi, last occupied by Jefferson Davis. So when Mississippi seceded from the Union, of course they lost their representation in the U.S. Senate, and so Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, abandoned his seat. They had no representation from 1861 to 1865. They were readmitted to the Union in 1868, and in 1870, a black Methodist preacher succeeded Jefferson Davis in the United States Senate. I want you to just think about that. African American senator from Mississippi. Just think about that. Okay. Then things go bad. Post-Reconstruction. No, I said 1877 with no end date. I'm not sure there's been an end date to post-Reconstruction. Post-Reconstruction was defined by one election. Whatever progress was being made for voting rights for African Americans was undone by a single election in 1876. Two men running for president, Samuel Tilden of New York, Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio. They got an equal number of electoral votes. Therefore, the election went to the House of Representatives. How do you swing them? Bear in mind that from the end of the Civil War, the Union Army was stationed in all the former Confederate states to protect the freedmen from reprisals by their former owners, and since 1870, to protect their right to vote. There was no change of heart in southern states. There was no concession that once the Constitution had been amended, we should fall in line. The only reason that voting rights in the Deep South were protected was because of the presence of the Union Army. Hayes says to the Southern representatives, if you vote for me, I'll reward your vote by withdrawing all of the federal soldiers from all the southern states and essentially return the South to state control. The Democratic Party, largely comprised of the former Confederates and the former slaveholders. They cast their vote for Rutherford B. Hayes, and in return, in 1877, after his inauguration, he does in fact withdraw all the soldiers. It is called the Compromise of 1876. It is the beginning of the end. of voting rights for African Americans. Bear in mind, at that point, more than 90% of African Americans were living in states affected by this compromise. So essentially, voting rights for African Americans was largely obliterated with the stroke of a pen. Next slide, please. How did it happen? What were the techniques that were used to deny voting rights? Well, the answer was voter suppression. There was no direct attack on the 15th Amendment. There was no attempt to repeal the 15th Amendment. There was no attempt to pass another amendment to undo it, as happened, for instance, with prohibition. First you passed it, then you undid it with a subsequent amendment. No. They found ways to get around the problem by having what they call pre-qualifying practices. You can vote if you can pass one of these pre-qualifying hurdles. Hurdle 1, the grandfather clause. You can vote in this county in 1877 if your grandfather was a qualified voter in this country, in this county, in 1877. Not your father, your grandfather. How many African Americans living in the Deep South do you suppose had grandfathers who were already qualified and registered to vote? So if you couldn't pass the first test, there's no point in going any further. You are disqualified by the grandfather clause. As subsequent years went by, there were, in fact, between 1870 and around 1900, 1910, 1920, there were people who could say, as a matter of fact, my grandfather was a qualified voter. Okay, pretty good. Now, the literacy test. Can you read, and as the sister said, not just read, but interpret to our satisfaction the meaning of a clause in the state constitution in whichever state they lived? Now, it didn't matter what you said. It was always wrong. You could read it, but if you couldn't explain it to the satisfaction of a registrar, then you couldn't do it. But of course, most African Americans in 1880, 1890, like a great many Americans, were not literate. Automatically excluded. Could not pass the pre-qualifying hurdles. And of course, there was the poll tax. If you were a sharecropper, living in perpetual debt, living from hand to mouth, how much money did you have to pay a poll tax in both the primary and general election? None. They never challenged the 15th Amendment. They just established these pre-qualifying tests, and the Congress, which had that language, the Congress shall pass appropriate legislation to enforce this amendment, chose never to challenge these practices. There was one more that came along, but there was no real name for it. If by chance you could pass all three of these, who wants to guess what the fourth hurdle was? How many votes do you suppose are in a bar of soap? How many bubbles could be produced by a bar of soap? Well, of course, they didn't say what size the bar of soap was. They didn't say, you know, was it lava soap, you know, or which had almost no bubbles. So in other words, if you could pass these, unlikely, there was always something else. And whatever your answer was, it was always wrong. So black voting rights, approved in 1870, was blocked by pre-qualifying hurdles. Now, I want to give you a phrase. It's a wonderful book for those who are really interested in this kind of thing, like me, called Origins of the Civil Rights Movement. Tries to talk about not the movement itself, but the preceding events, conditions, circumstances, practices, and problems into which the civil rights movement was launched. And in that book, the author, Alden Morris, described what he called the tripartite three-part system of oppression. If you really want to understand what it was like to be black in America, especially in the South, from 1877 for a long time, then these three steps must be kept in mind. One, do everything you can to keep the black population in as much poverty as possible. And do that by limiting their vocational options. Now, most African Americans were involved in agriculture, sharecropping. Here's how it worked. You would rent a plot of land. You would plant some crop. Sugar cane, cotton, tobacco, rice, indigo, wheat, whatever the crop was. But you would have to rent tools from the owner. You'd have to acquire seed from the owner. You lived in a shack owned by the owner, so there was rent. And if you ever drew anything from the owner for food or other commodities, all of that was kept track of. At the end of the year, they would then tally up the value of your crop and measure that against how much you owed. Well, surprisingly, you always owed more than the crop was worth. Then they passed a law that said you cannot move off the plantation if you are in debt. So you're stuck there. If you try to leave, it becomes a felony. You can be arrested. You can be sent to prison. So the next year, you plant another crop. And the same thing happens. And the next year, you plant another crop. And the same thing happens. And you end up being deeper and deeper and deeper in debt. And nobody allows you to work in any other field. So keep them impoverished. 2, said Morris, keep them politically powerless so they cannot vote their way out of this condition. Don't ever let black people vote. In 1930, this is a personal story, I had a uncle, great uncle, I suppose, from Kentucky, which is our home state, named Edward Donahue. He was born in 1870. In 1930, when he was 60 years old, he went to register to vote for the first time. 60. He didn't think about it in his 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. For some reason, he thought that by 1930 things had changed. So he went to the county seat to register. He was told, and I referenced the December 7th and December 14th, 1930 editions of the Chicago Defender, a national black newspaper, where this is documented. He went to vote, to register. He was told, ends, I'll refrain from using the word, but you know what I mean, ends cannot vote in Kentucky. Now, Kentucky's up south. And that's a border state. Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland. This is not Mississippi or Alabama. This is Kentucky. Ends cannot vote in Kentucky. Nowhere in Kentucky. He said, well, I've come to register. And got perturbed. I told you. Ends do not vote in Kentucky. This is in the newspaper article. Now, where he got the courage for this next step, I'll never know. But it is reported that he said, well, I'm not leaving until I'm registered to vote. At which time the registrar pulled out a pistol and shot him dead. He was taken to the sheriff's office where he pled self-defense against an unarmed man. You're shocked till you read the third line. Keep them in fear of terrible reprisals if they ever sought to alter their conditions. Central to the political powerlessness of black people were the story she just told you about Jimmy Lee Jackson and Viola Liuzzo and James Reeb and the three boys who came to Mississippi, Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman. You cannot factor out of American history this third component. Absent this third component, things might have moved more swiftly. But if the grand wizard of the Ku Klux Klan is on the jury, and if half the Southern sheriffs were members of the Ku Klux Klan, and if between 1895 and 1925 there are more than 3,000 recorded lynchings accompanied by bodies being burned, body parts being cut off as souvenirs, and people bringing their children to watch the execution and then have a picnic afterwards while the body is still hanging there. Put these three things together. And that's what black people in the South were up against till the next time. All of that I just described, post-Reconstruction, poverty, political powerlessness, and terror. Let me just pause there. Terror. It's in the news. isn't it? Acts of terror. Shooting in a theater, terror. Shooting in a LGBT nightclub in Florida. Terror. For most Americans, since 9/11, terror is a recent phenomenon. Nothing in their daily life would expose them to terror. For black people in America, terror was a daily possibility. Look at someone the wrong way, terror. Speak out of line to someone, terror could follow. My hometown of Chicago, 1955, Emmett Till from Chicago, suburban Chicago, went to Money, Mississippi to visit an uncle in town. He was not accustomed to Southern mores, Southern traditions by which young black men spoke in public. He didn't know anything about that. He saw a white woman. He said something, I don't know what he said, but she didn't like it. She told her husband. He got a friend. They went to the house where he was staying. They took him out. Just took him out. Beat him. Shot him. Tied the motor of a cotton gin around his neck with barbed wire and threw his body into a river. Of course, there was a trial. How long was the trial for Jimmy Lee Jackson or for Jonathan? 97 minutes? 96 minutes? The trial for the murderers of Emmett Till took 45 minutes. Before all of them were found not guilty, and they said, we could have done it faster, but we wanted to have a cigar and Coca-Cola. They didn't go back to consider the evidence. It was a foregone conclusion. There would be no accountability of a white person killing a black person in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas. And then came this. August the 6th, 1965. The Voting Rights Act, which essentially removed all of those pre-qualifying conditions. No new amendment was required. All you needed was to make those previously enforced pre-qualifying actions illegal. So they removed all those obstacles so that African Americans could now vote without the grandfather clause, without the poll tax, without the literacy test, without the how many bubbles are in the bar of soap, without terror, without threats, without. Here was the central provision. This was the heart of the Voting Rights Act. 10 states with the worst record for preventing blacks from voting could not make any changes in their state voting laws without federal court or Department of Justice approval. And every 5 years, the Voting Rights Act had to be, reaffirmed to see if there was any progress being made. So the whole point of the Voting Rights Act was to prevent voter suppression by making it illegal to use anything to prevent one person from voting if it was not being uniformly imposed on the whole voting public. It was the high mark of the civil rights movement. Next slide. Then came this. Shelby County versus Holder being Eric. In a 5-4 decision, with my brother Clarence Thomas voting with the 5. The central provision of the Voting Rights Act was deemed unconstitutional. That provision being that states could not alter their voting laws without federal court approval. That was deemed by the Roberts Court in a 5-4 vote on June 25th, 2013, to be unconstitutional. That unleashed the next slide. This was John Roberts' explanation. Our nation has changed, he said. We don't need the Voting Rights Act because the 2008 and 2012 presidential election proved there were no restrictions on blacks having the right to vote. What was happening in 2008 and 2012? Barack Obama. I knew a member of Congress when I was living in Cleveland, and she was totally and absolutely committed in 2008 to Hillary Clinton. And she said she was going to go to South Carolina, to go to black churches in South Carolina to organize black women to vote for Hillary Clinton in the 2008 election. I said to her, Congresswoman, no disrespect, you must be out of your mind. Do you really think, with this black man running, that those black women are going to put gender over race? She said, yes, if I can make my case, they will. I said, well, God bless you. She went down there, and the first time she tried that, they said to her, members of Congress, honey, why are you here? Don't you know all of us are going to vote for this black man? We're not opposed to Mrs. Clinton, but we're not going to vote for her over this black man. 2000, so he got 94% of the black vote, which John Roberts then took to mean that all opposition to black voting rights was over. Therefore, since the country has changed, who needs it? The next year, 2013, the Supreme Court ruled to weaken that restriction. The next day, not the next week, not the next month, not the next year, the next day, 7 states began to reintroduce voter suppression tactics. What were they? Let's go to the next slide. This first point, this ridiculous notion of voter fraud. First, it was 3 to 4 million people who voted illegally. Of course, nobody could find them. But he was convinced he would have won the popular vote if it hadn't been for the 3 to 4 million people who voted illegally. Okay, that was crazy. Then he said, Kelly Ayotte in New Hampshire would have won re-election to the Senate if thousands of voters from Massachusetts had not gone to New Hampshire to vote against her. Just absolutely unfounded claims. Ridiculous. I could go on, but I won't. The issue was never voter fraud. The issue was voter suppression. The issue were these things designed primarily to limit access to the voting booth. So now you've got to show an ID, a government-issued ID. I've been voting in New York since my arrival. I voted in Ohio. I voted in New York when we first got married. I never showed an ID. But in some states, not just a student ID, a government-issued ID, which you have to pay money to get. Guess what that is? It's a poll tax. It's a poll tax. Or limit the number of early voting days. So if you don't want to take off from work to go to vote, and you want to vote ahead of time, limit the number of days available for early voting. Or in the black church, there was this concept of souls to the polls. You'd go to church, you'd leave church, you'd go on the bus, you'd go downtown, and you'd vote on a Sunday. In North Carolina, they did everything they could to try and enforce a blue law on voting on Sunday. You shouldn't use the Lord's Day. You could lynch on a Sunday, but you couldn't vote. Or there is still the practice of limiting voting rights in 9 states to those who've been convicted of a felony. These things began to be reintroduced immediately after the weakening of the voting rights, or decrease the number of polling places, or change them, or decrease the number of voting machines, but only in certain districts. Voter suppression. Is there another slide? Let's see if there is.
No, that's the end.
That's the last slide. Okay, so you wanted a history of voting rights, using Selma as the centerpiece. Prior to Selma, the problem was voter suppression. After 2013, the problem is voter suppression. I don't see anything in the current political configuration that leads me to believe that persons who are in largely gerrymandered congressional districts designed to protect their re-electability are going to redraw the lines of their district in ways that make them vulnerable to a primary challenge, much less to a general election challenge. So I think the dynamics of our electoral process are locked in, unless there is a citizens' revolt. That's what the march was. The march didn't happen because things have already changed. Sisters, did it? The march happened in the teeth of no change. Persons who were willing to put life and limb at risk to exercise the most basic American right. The right to vote. Without an ID card. Without having the days to vote cut short. Without eliminating registration on election day. Without going to your polling place and discovering it's been relocated. Just let people vote. So I'll stop. And maybe a question or two, if we have time, could prompt me to say what my slides didn't. Yes?
Yes, Dr. McMillan, do you see voter suppression in Monroe County particularly? I mean, we have some very good commissioners, and I'm just wondering where, if you see that it's a fair system that we have here, or do you feel that we could do better?
There were sections of New York, sections of California, sections of Michigan, sections even of Alaska that were affected by the Voting Rights Act because there were attempts by one means or another to prevent people from having fair access to the polls. I don't know enough yet about places outside of sort of the greater Rochester area, but I think the worst danger to our political process is really at the state legislative level, where congressional district lines are drawn so that you can create districts, however bizarre the shape of those districts are, to create safe seats in which persons of whatever political stripe can live and run and function and not face any serious challenge. This is not, I don't know that that's the case in Monroe County, but there are counties in New York State where gerrymandered districts do exist, where persons of a different political party have no chance of winning. And even if there was a primary challenge from the left, very unlikely that an old-style Republican could unseat this new group that is gravitating further and further and further into kind of xenophobic nationalism, America First stuff. So, yeah, these are very challenging times. Yes.
Is your assessment of how many votes were actually, how many people did not vote because of what happened in these states? And also, are there any lawsuits being initiated?
There are lawsuits in every state where any ID laws, I failed to mention Ohio, where ID laws are being used, early voting days are being restricted, souls to the polls is being challenged. Every state is facing lawsuits, and some have already won. In North Carolina, a lot of those early attempts at suppression were ruled unconstitutional based upon the Voting Rights Act. So you have to constantly push back. It takes persistence. It takes continued attentiveness. Because once you let your guard down and assume that everything is in order, these elements that would love to turn the clock back, my wife and I say all the time, we have met people who would love to go back to slavery. Their languages, this is a white person's country. And white culture is being threatened. And the demographics are not promising. So how do we dig in our heels and draw a line and say we can't let this go any further because at some point we lose all that we have? I'm not hesitant to say that is exactly what Steve Bannon believes. Exactly. Now, he's not whispering into the ear of Breitbart News. I could care less about Breitbart News. But when it's in the White House, in the West Wing, in the Oval Office, on the National Security Council, then I've got some real concerns about the course of our nation. I hope the grown-ups in the room will prevail, but I'm not overly confident. But now bear in mind, you can tell right away where my politics and my sentiments are. So if yours aren't there, I'm not mad at you. We just don't agree. But I am deeply concerned about the course that our nation is headed toward. Deeply concerned. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, Reverend. You said, pointed to Selma and the civil rights movement as a citizens' revolution when there was no change. And, you know, perhaps that is something that people need to rise up and participate in going forward in these times. But as you can see, we are a group of, well, the main numbers, blocks of people who are not participating, not voting regularly, are youth and people living in poverty. And we don't seem to really know how to reach those groups. We do voter registration and we have some impact there, but getting out the vote once people are registered. So do you have any insight?
Let me, I think it was either Leonard Pitts or Charles Blow, one of the other columnists, who was echoing, not an original thought, echoing someone else who said, the Democratic Party is going after the wrong white people. By which they meant, you can either go for the white population that voted for Trump in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, or the number, much larger number, who voted in third-party campaigns. More white people voted for Jill Stein and Gary Johnson than voted for Trump. So that there are people voting. They are progressive in their ideas. They are looking for change. They do not happen to be the persons that are the focus of our attention at this moment. How do we go back to get disgruntled auto workers? How do you go back to get disgruntled persons from Appalachia? How do you go back to get them? That is one population. I'm not opposed to going to get them. But the question is, there's a whole nother constituency that did vote. They just didn't vote for Hillary Clinton. They would have voted for Bernie Sanders. So the question becomes, how much of what we have as present political reality is really because Trump sort of ran the field, which he insists that he did, but he didn't. And how much is because we had an uninspiring Democratic candidate who lost massive numbers of votes, enough to win the election, if they hadn't gone to third and fourth party candidates. Young folks were voting up to the Democratic convention. And the folks who voted for Barack Obama in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Indiana, didn't cross over to Mrs. Clinton. How much of that was because of the FBI? I don't know. Or emails? I don't know. Or they just were disgruntled because they wanted Bernie. I'm not nearly as pessimistic about the future. I think it's just that there's a left that's going unoccupied. We gravitate to the center. Okay, you have to govern from the center. But you got to reach the folks who are not happy from the left. And they were here. They voted. They just didn't vote for the Democratic nominee. They were young, they were urban, they were suburban, they were rural, they were all kind of folks. How do you get them to come back? I think you've got to find a candidate that will attract them. And that, by the way, is the job of the new chairman of the Democratic Party. He is to go out and find these folks and give them a reason to come back. Now, Trump himself will give them a half a dozen reasons to come back. Because everything he promised to do will affect his own base negatively. You can repeal Obamacare if you want to, except you got folks in Appalachia who are saying the only way we can pay to cover black lung disease is through Obamacare. Okay, so repeal it. And see what happens to your constituency. And discover how quickly they will change their mind, unless he changes his. I don't know. Yes, ma'am.
In New York State, you can do early voting through absentee ballot, but you have to have a reason for doing it. It calls for a reason when you fill that out. Well, you lost.
You have to say you're not going to be in town, not just a reason, you have to say you're not in town, as I recall.
On election day.
On election day, and so.
Well, no, like if you are an election inspector, you can do an absentee ballot if you can't get to your home.
Or if you're a caregiver for
But you have to have a reason.
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, I think
that's something we should change.
so long as any restriction is universally imposed and everybody faces the same one, that's okay. It may not be fair, I don't know, but it's not limited to an ethnic group or a region of the country.
But we're talking
All of us in New York State would have to give a reason.
But we're talking about early voting.
Yeah. So long as it's uniformly enforced, then we all have a stake in whether or not we want to see it changed. If you want to have it changed, there's a process for that. But I very seldom, if ever, have done absentee ballots. I like to go myself, do what needs to be done. Yes, sir.
Wasn't the poll tax universally enforced, but it was designed to have greatest impact on black people who happen to be the least able to participate?
That's why they had to amend it in 1964. The 24th Amendment, which repealed the poll tax. Now that's, by the way, years later, is because it wasn't just black people who were affected. Anybody who had to sort of clear a hurdle. There was a time in this country when the only people who could vote were white males over 21 who owned 100 acres of land. That was the beginning. Kind of a gentry elite. And then, you got these populist presidents like Jackson, who began to expand voting rights to less affluent people. So the notion of voting has always been how to expand it from its beginning very narrow base. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. The poll tax was imposed on anybody that somebody else didn't want to have the right to vote. Poor people are too stupid to vote. So let's block their access to it by fixing a dollar amount which will prohibit them from voting, because who needs them? Stupid farmers, stupid laborers. Let the elite, we know better. Let the enlightened, I thought we were getting ready to drain the swamp. It's just got restocked. But those who always know better, let them make all the decisions. That's a good point. Yes, ma'am.
Quick question. I know Trump lost 2 million votes. Is there any way to tabulate all those people who voted for their party?
Oh yeah,
Have they done that?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, in certain, see, they're doing this more state by state than,
Will we see a number?
I don't know how it's being reported, but there were clearly states, bear in mind, he won Wisconsin by what, 22,000 votes? Between those who didn't vote and those who voted for third and fourth parties, it was within reach. Any one state would have made the difference.
But you don't know how they can.
I don't know myself. I'm sure somebody in the voting world would answer that. Of course, it would have helped if she'd gone to Wisconsin to campaign.
Yeah, right.
If you run a 50-state campaign, you might win. If you don't run a 50-state campaign, you'll probably lose. Tactical error. Yes, sir.
You've said in the past and alluded to it tonight that at some point we're going to have to put ourselves at risk. Until the movement coalesces, that enough people say we're going to get on buses and go to Alabama or Wisconsin or wherever the state legislature is changing the laws. Besides the ACLU, who else should we support in those suits?
NAACP Legal Defense Fund.
Okay.
Southern Poverty Law Center. Yeah, I mean, there are some entities who have a national reach, a really good database, and they have good credibility across the country. Those are very good suggestions. The NAACP, Southern Poverty Law Center. There's a national coalition of civil rights organizations called the National Civil Rights Leadership Group. So I think the question is not the who. The real trick is what. What made Selma so memorable was that the objective was so clear. What made Montgomery in 1955, Rosa Parks, Martin King, so memorable was the objective was so clear. We want to have the right to sit where we want on a bus. Pass that law. We want the right to have access to all public accommodations. Civil Rights Bill, 1964. We want the right to vote. Voting Rights Act, 1965. Once the hard things, the obvious things, the in-your-face things were resolved, it becomes more complicated. Because then you can't say to a private employer, we want the right to work in your firm. Now, I was finishing high school in Chicago. I went to a vocational school. I was a printer, graphic design, old-fashioned, linotype machines, hot, metal printing. I worked for a printing company. If I had not been an apprentice coming from a vocational school, I would have gone through their usual hiring process, which was as follows. A white person comes and applies for a job, and they give you a pen. And you fill out the application with an ink pen. A black person comes and applies for a job, and they give you a pencil. And you fill the application out with a pencil. You both go through exactly the same process, but when the Human Resources Office decides who they want to hire, they have already been informed, only respond to the ones filled out in Inc. Chicago. My wife is from Georgia. In Georgia, in Elberton, Georgia, northeast Georgia, they never desegregated the schools. The Brown decision was 1954. In 1978, instead of using the term desegregate, they used the term consolidate. They said, why do we have 2 high schools? We don't need 2 high schools. Why do we have 2 sets of middle schools? We don't need 2 sets of middle schools. Why do we have 2 sets of elementary schools? Let's consolidate, forgetting the reasons why. You ever had 2 high schools, 2 sets of middle schools, 2 sets of elementary? Why did you have those? Segregation. Now comes the question. If you consolidate 2 high schools into 1, who becomes the principal? Who becomes the head of the science department? Who become the bus drivers? Who become the cooks in the kitchen? Who becomes the coach of the football team? Funny thing, how consolidation resulted in integration of the classrooms with the loss of black leadership. Now, how did folk in the South get around Brown? When I first met Peggy, we would drive through the South, and I would see these cornerstones on these church buildings. And the cornerstones had dates like 1961, 1960, 1959, 1958 on these educational wings. In the South, to get around the Brown decision to desegregate, they just started Christian academies, which were private by nature. Starting in 58, 59, 60, you could limit your school, private school, to only white students. So today, Little Rock Central High School, which was 100% white, is now 95% black because all the white students were pulled out by their parents to go to all white private schools. There's always a way out if you don't want to do the right thing. These are issues that no black person can resolve. Racism is not going to be defeated because a black person leads the charge. That battle must be fought from within. Somebody white has to say to somebody else white, you got to change. We got to change. This has got to change. And until there is an intolerance within the white majority for the existence of systems and practices that perpetuate discrimination and disadvantage, until that happens, all of the fussing by black people will amount to precious little. White people have to fix this. I'll be happy when you do. I can't. I've been trying. I don't have access to certain places. I don't have access to certain people. But other whites do. And it has to come in large measure from the changes of art that way. Yes, sir.
Within a few more decades, the white majority will no longer be. There'll be a minority.
In numbers.
In numbers. And so there's going to be, something very special and important happening over the next few decades. Either we as a nation resolve this, or we're going to have revolution, armed revolution.
Well, I don't want to predict that, but I will tell you this. Numerical advantage alone will result in minority rule. because of the economic systems that will continue to remain by designs, by laws, by practices in the hands of a certain population. I watched this morning when the president sat down with the heads of the major insurance companies. What was the first thing I noticed about that meeting? Every one of them was a white male. So where does the diversity of opinion come in? Unless one of them, unless Aetna is going to challenge Prudential, or Prudential is going to challenge Progressive, or Progressive is going to challenge Hartford, or the Hartford is going to challenge John Hancock. Otherwise, they'll just get behind closed doors and figure out how to stay in charge. This becomes South Africa. This becomes one man, one vote. Nelson Mandela, wonderful, wonderful. But the economic power never changed hands. There's the trick. That's finally what Martin King discovered. That behind it all, behind the voting rights, behind everything, is control of the economic system. And that's going to be the biggest struggle of all. I'm reading a book right now about the French Revolution, and that's really what happened. There came a point when that little snippet comment, let them eat bread, just rubbed folk the wrong way. No, we're not going to eat bread, we're going to have your head. It took them 10 years, but they got it. I hope it doesn't come to that, I really do. But people change their hearts and minds slowly. I thought, really, and I'm going to stop, I thought, naively, that the election of President Obama would at least chart a new direction. Little did I know that on the night he was being inaugurated, there were Southern senators conspiring to block everything he tried to do. And now they are the ones who are complaining about folks trying to block what they're trying to do. I mean, the hypocrisy and irony is too much to be ignored. Well, I got to stop because we got to get up at 9 o'clock.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening for this important discussion. You've left us with good challenges and with wonderful stories that move our hearts and hopefully the rest of us. We're so grateful to Sister Ann Urquhart, Sister Josepha, and Sister Barbara Lum. Reverend Marvin McMickle, you are a treasure. To our hosts here at Asbury First United Methodist Church, to our program chair, Mary Myers, and this time her husband, Tom, and all the members of our local league who make this forum possible. You'll find some information about the league at the table on your way out, and I'd like to remind you that our next two forums are going to be held here at Asbury First on March 27th, when we'll be looking at Women's History Month. Our guest speakers will be Rochester historian Christine Rudarski and Susan B. Anthony Museum President Deborah Hughes. And then on April 24th, we'll be exploring poverty here in Rochester. And please check our website for remaining details. You have a flyer on your seats regarding the April 24th forum. I thank you again for being here. Please drive carefully.